Elijah Carson was 63 years old when he pulled a dying girl from the Snake River, and he thought he was simply doing what any decent person would do. By sunrise the next morning, 12 tribal elders stood silent as statues at his gate, their weathered faces painted with symbols he'd never seen before, and Elijah realized his act of mercy had awakened something ancient that would change his life forever. But to understand why these powerful men had traveled hundreds of miles to stand at the gate of a forgotten rancher, you need to know about the promise made in blood 40 years earlier, and how one old man's kindness fulfilled a prophecy he never knew existed. The November cold bit through Elijah's worn coat as he rode along the river that evening, checking the fence line one last time before winter set in hard. At his age, these rides were becoming more difficult, his joints stiff and his eyes not as sharp as they once were, but the routine kept him moving when grief might otherwise have claimed him. His wife Margaret had been gone 3 years now, and their son had died in a mining accident 5 years before that, leaving Elijah alone on the 1,000-acre spread he'd built with his own hands. The Snake River ran fast and angry that time of year, swollen with early snowmelt from the mountains and treacherous enough to kill anyone foolish enough to fall in, which is why Elijah's heart nearly stopped when he saw the dark shape caught against the fallen cottonwood that stretched into the current. At first he thought it might be a deer or elk, but as he urged his horse closer to the bank, he realized with horror that it was a person, a young woman, her long black hair streaming in the current, her body pressed against the log by the force of the water. She wasn't moving. Elijah didn't hesitate. Despite his age and the dangerous current, he spurred his horse into the shallows and fought his way to the fallen tree. The icy water soaked through his boots and pants, numbing his legs, but he managed to grab the woman's arm and pull her free from the river's grip. She was unconscious, her lips blue with cold, and her breathing so shallow he could barely detect it. Her traditional native dress was torn and bloody, and a nasty gash across her forehead suggested she'd struck rocks during her fall into the river. But what caught Elijah's attention were the rope burns around her wrists and the bruises on her throat that spoke of violence, not accident. Someone had hurt this girl before she ended up in the river. Elijah lifted her carefully onto his horse, wrapping her in his own coat before mounting behind her to hold her steady. She was light as a bird, probably no more than 18 or 19, and so cold her skin felt like marble. The ride back to his cabin seemed to take forever, with Elijah constantly checking to make sure she was still breathing. His cabin was small but warm, built from logs he'd cut himself when he first claimed this land. Elijah laid the girl on his bed and immediately began working to save her life, stripping away her wet clothes and wrapping her in every blanket he owned. Her pulse was weak but steady, and the head wound, while bloody, didn't appear to be fatal. As he cleaned her injuries by lamplight, Elijah noticed details that told him this was no ordinary young woman. Her dress, though torn, was beautifully crafted with intricate beadwork that must have taken months to complete. The silver jewelry around her neck and in her ears was of exceptional quality, suggesting she came from a family of importance within her tribe. More concerning were the other injuries he discovered, bruises on her arms consistent with being grabbed and held, scratches on her back that looked like she'd been dragged through brush, and those rope burns that told a story of captivity and escape. She stirred as he bandaged the gash on her forehead, her dark eyes fluttering open to focus on his weathered face with a mixture of fear and confusion. "Easy, child," Elijah said softly. "You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you here." She tried to speak, but only a whisper emerged. Elijah brought her water, supporting her head as she drank, and gradually some color returned to her pale cheeks. "Chenoa," she managed finally, touching her chest to indicate her name. Elijah, he replied, pointing to himself. You're in my cabin. I pulled you from the river. Chenoa's eyes widened with something that might have been recognition, though Elijah couldn't imagine how this young woman would know anything about him. What he didn't know was that 40 years earlier, his name had been spoken in sacred ceremonies, written in tribal records, and woven into prophecies that few living people remembered. The old rancher who lived by the Snake River, the stories said, would one day save the daughter of the wind, and when that day came, the ancient debts would finally be paid. Chenoa slept fitfully through the night, murmuring words in her native tongue that Elijah didn't understand, but recognized as the sounds of someone reliving trauma. He dozed in his chair beside the bed, waking every time she stirred, ready to comfort her if the nightmares became too intense. When morning light filtered through the cabin's small windows, she was awake and watching him with intelligent dark eyes that seemed to be evaluating everything about him, from his weathered hands to the simple furnishings of his modest home. You have kind eyes, she said in clear English, surprising him with both the observation and her fluency, like the stories said you would. Elijah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What stories? Chenoa struggled to sit up, and Elijah helped her, noting that her color was much better and her breathing had returned to normal. The head wound was healing cleanly, and the warmth had returned to her skin. My grandmother told me about the old white man who lives by the Snake River, the one who carries the mark of honor from our people. She looked directly at his left shoulder, where Elijah knew an old scar lay hidden beneath his shirt. She said, when the time came, he would save the daughter of Chief Iron Wolf. Elijah's hand moved instinctively to his shoulder, where a Shoshone arrow had pierced him during a skirmish 40 years earlier. Not many people knew about that scar, and fewer still knew the story behind it. Your grandmother knew about that? She was there when it happened. She was the medicine woman who treated your wound after my great-grandfather chose to spare your life instead of taking it. Chenoa's voice carried the weight of family history, carefully preserved through generations. She said you were different from the other soldiers, that you showed respect even when facing death. The memories came flooding back to Elijah, details he'd tried to forget for 4 decades. He'd been a young cavalry scout then, barely 23, separated from his unit during a patrol that had gone wrong. 3 Shoshone warriors had cornered him in a box canyon, and he'd expected to die with an arrow through his heart. Instead, the eldest warrior had studied him for a long moment, then lowered his bow and spoken in broken English. You do not run like a coward. You do not beg like a child. You will carry my mark and remember this mercy. The arrow that followed had been precise, piercing his shoulder muscle without hitting bone or vital organs, a warning and a brand, marking him as someone who had been judged and found worthy of life. Chief Iron Wolf, Elijah said slowly, that was your great-grandfather. Yes, and I am Chenoa, daughter of Chief White Eagle, granddaughter of Chief Running Bear, great-granddaughter of Chief Iron Wolf. She paused, letting the weight of her lineage settle between them. I am the last direct descendant of the bloodline. Elijah felt pieces of an enormous puzzle clicking into place. What happened to you? How did you end up in the river? Chenoa's expression darkened, and she pulled the blanket more tightly around her shoulders. White men came to our winter camp 3 days ago. Not soldiers, but traders who said they had government papers giving them the right to take young women for cultural education in their schools back east. Elijah's jaw tightened. He'd heard rumors of such operations, unscrupulous men who used forged documents to kidnap native women and sell them to brothels or forced labor situations far from home. They took 6 girls, including me, but they made a mistake when they camped by the river last night. Chenoa's eyes flashed with the same fierce pride Elijah remembered seeing in her great-grandfather's face all those years ago. They didn't Know I could cut ropes with a sharp stone, or that I could swim in water that would kill them. You escaped by jumping in the Snake River." Elijah was impressed and horrified in equal measure. The river was nearly freezing, with currents that had claimed experienced swimmers. "I knew the stories. I knew you lived downstream, and I knew the prophecy said you would save the daughter of the wind when she came to you from the water." Chenoa smiled grimly. "Sometimes faith is the only strategy that makes sense. The daughter of the wind. That is what Iron Wolf called me in the naming ceremony. He said I would be the one to bridge the old ways and the new, but only if I could find the white man marked by honor when the time of great choosing arrived." Elijah moved to the window, ostensibly to check the weather, but actually to process what Chenoa was telling him. Outside, the November sky was gray and heavy with the promise of snow, but something else caught his attention. Shapes moving along the distant ridge, too deliberate to be wildlife. "Chenoa," he said quietly, "I think your people have found you." She joined him at the window, and together they watched as 12 figures on horseback appeared on the horizon, moving slowly and purposefully toward the cabin. Even at this distance, Elijah could see they were elderly men, their posture speaking of dignity and authority earned through decades of leadership. "The Council of Elders," Chenoa breathed. "All 12 chiefs of the tribal confederacy. They haven't gathered together in over 20 years. What does it mean?" Chenoa turned to look at him, and Elijah saw something in her eyes that might have been awe. "It means the prophecy is coming true. It means the time of great choosing has arrived, and the spirits have guided me to the one person who can help our people survive what's coming." As the 12 riders drew closer, Elijah realized that his quiet life of solitude was about to end forever. The 12 elders dismounted at Elijah's gate with the synchronized precision of men who had performed ceremonies together for decades. They arranged themselves in a perfect semicircle, each chief representing a different band of the great Shoshone Confederation, their weathered faces painted with symbols that spoke of sacred purposes and solemn duties. Elijah stepped onto a porch with Chenoa beside him, noting how she straightened despite her injuries, carrying herself with the dignity befitting her lineage. The morning air was crisp and still, as if the very wind was holding its breath for what was about to unfold. The eldest of the chiefs, a man whose white hair hung past his shoulders and whose face bore the scars of countless battles, stepped forward. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to speaking for thousands. "I am Chief Grey Hawk, keeper of the ancient ways and speaker for the Council of Elders. We come seeking Elijah Carson, the white man marked by iron. Wolf in the year of the great buffalo disappearance." Elijah felt Chenoa's hand briefly touch his arm, a gesture of support and encouragement. "I am Elijah Carson," he replied, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment. Greyhawk studied him with eyes that seemed to see through to his soul. "Show us the mark." Without hesitation, Elijah unbuttoned his shirt and pulled it aside, revealing the old scar on his left shoulder where Iron Wolf's arrow had pierced him 4 decades earlier. The wound had healed into a distinctive star-shaped mark, and several of the elders murmured in recognition. "The prophecy spoke true," Greyhawk announced. "The marked one has saved the daughter of the wind, and the time of great choosing has arrived." Another chief, younger but still bearing the gravitas of leadership, stepped forward. "I am Chief Red Thunder. We bring news that will require all our courage and wisdom. The men who took our daughters are not simple criminals. They work for those who would destroy our people through means more terrible than any war." Chenoa tensed beside Elijah. "What do you mean, grandfather?" "The government has made a new treaty with those who hate us," Greyhawk explained, his voice heavy with grim knowledge. "Under the guise of education and civilization, They planned to take every young person from every reservation and send them far from our lands, far from our ways, far from any hope of return. Elijah felt ice form in his stomach as the full scope of the plan became clear. Cultural extinction, he said quietly. Yes, Red Thunder confirmed, but they cannot do this by force alone. They need our compliance, our agreement, our surrender of the children willingly given. A third chief, distinguished by intricate tattoos covering his arms, spoke for the first time. I am Chief Stone Bear. The men who took our daughters carry documents they claim give them federal authority. They say if we resist, the army will and come with fire and steel to take not just our children, but our lives. Chenoa's voice was barely above a whisper. How many have been taken? Nearly 100 girls from 7 reservations, Greyhawk replied. They are being held in a place called Fort Morrison, 2 days' ride from here. From there, they will be shipped east to schools that are prisons in all but name. Elijah had heard of such places, institutions where native children were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their customs, or maintain any connection to their heritage. The official policy was called Kill the Indian, Save the Man, and it represented a different kind of genocide, slower but just as deadly. Why have you come to me? Elijah asked, though he was beginning to understand. Stone Bear reached into his ceremonial pouch and withdrew an object that made Elijah's breath catch in his throat. It was an eagle feather, but one unlike any he'd ever seen, with silver wire woven through the shaft and small turquoise stones attached to the tips. This is the feather of choosing, Stone Bear explained. It has been carried by our people for 300 years, passed down from chief to chief, waiting for the moment when it would be needed to save our nation. Greyhawk's voice took on the rhythmic cadence of ritual. The prophecy says that when our people face their greatest threat, when the choice is between survival and extinction, the feather of choosing must be carried by one who stands between 2 worlds, one who has been marked by honor and proven by sacrifice. Chenoa turned to look at Elijah, and he saw in her eyes the same fierce determination that had carried her through freezing water to reach his door. The prophecy says this: "Person will lead a great rescue," she said softly, "not with armies or weapons, but with courage and wisdom that unites those who should be enemies." Red Thunder stepped closer to the porch. Elijah Carson, we ask you to carry the feather of choosing. We ask you to help us save our daughters and our future. Elijah looked at the 12 most powerful leaders in the region, men who commanded, the loyalty of thousands of warriors, asking him, a solitary old rancher, to help them in their darkest hour. What exactly are you asking me to do? Greyhawk's smile was grim, but determined. We are asking you to help us rescue 100 girls from a federal installation, expose the men who would destroy our people through lies and false documents, and do it all in a way that brings justice instead of war. The weight of prophecy, honor, and desperate hope settled on Elijah's shoulders like a mantle he'd never expected to wear. Elijah Carson had lived 63 years without believing in prophecies. But as he reached out and accepted the sacred eagle feather from Chief Stone Bear, he felt the weight of destiny settling into his bones like winter cold. The 12 elders watched in respectful silence as he held the ancient relic, its silver threads catching the morning light. "I'll help you," he said simply, "but not because of any prophecy. I'll help because 100 girls deserve better than being stolen from their families." Greyhawk nodded approvingly. Spoken like a man worthy of carrying the feather of choosing. What followed was the most intense planning session of Elijah's life. The elders spread detailed maps across his kitchen table, marking guard positions at Fort Morrison, escape routes through the mountains, and safe houses where rescued girls could be hidden until the crisis passed. But it was Chenoa who provided the crucial insight that would make the rescue possible. The men who took us, aren't federal agents," she explained, pointing to sketches she'd made of their captors. "They're private contractors using forged documents. Real federal marshals wouldn't recognize their authority." Elijah felt a plan forming in his mind, dangerous but possible. What if we didn't rescue the girls by force? What if we rescued them by law? Chief Red Thunder leaned forward intently. "Explain." "I know Marshal Harrison in Cheyenne, served with his brother during the war. If I can get word to him about the false documents and the illegal kidnapping operation, he'd be obligated to investigate. But the girls could be moved before any marshal arrives," Stone Bear protested. "Not if they're too busy dealing with a crisis to worry about moving prisoners." Elijah's weathered face split into a grin that reminded everyone why he'd survived. 40 years in hostile territory. "Chenoa, how many of those girls know the country around Fort Morrison?" "Most of them. We've all hunted and gathered in those hills since childhood. Then we don't need to break them out. We need to give them a reason and an opportunity to break themselves out." The plan that emerged was audacious in its simplicity. While Marshal Harrison rode toward Fort Morrison with federal authority to investigate the illegal operation, Elijah and a small group of warriors would create a diversion that would draw the guards away from the compound. In the confusion, the imprisoned girls would escape through routes they knew better than their captors ever could. 2 days later, Elijah found himself lying in tall grass, overlooking Fort Morrison, the sacred feather tucked securely in his vest pocket. Beside him, Chief Red Thunder whispered final instructions to 6 young warriors whose job was to make as much noise as possible while staying safely out of range. At precisely noon, the diversion began. War cries echoed from 3 different directions as the warriors set grass fires and shot arrows into the wooden walls of the outer compound. The guards, thinking they were under attack by a full war party, rushed to defensive positions facing outward. They never noticed the 100 young women slipping quietly out the back of the main building and disappearing into the forest like ghosts. By the time Marshal Harrison arrived with federal warrants and a squad of real soldiers, the girls were miles away, and the fraudulent contractors were facing serious questions about their forged documents and illegal detention of American citizens. That evening, as Elijah sat on his porch, watching the sun set over the mountains, Chenoa approached carrying a bundle wrapped in soft deerskin. "The Council of Elders asked me to give you this," she said, unwrapping what appeared to be a simple leather journal. "What is it?" "The true record of the prophecy," Chenoa explained, "written by my great-grandfather Iron Wolf after he marked you with his arrow 40 years ago." Elijah opened the journal and found pages covered with careful drawings and English words written in an uncertain hand. The story they told took his breath away. Iron Wolf had recognized something in the young soldier he'd spared, a quality of honor that transcended the uniform he wore. The old chief had spent the rest of his life preparing for the day when that honor would be needed to save his people, weaving the story into tribal lore and training his descendants to recognize the signs. "He knew," Elijah whispered. "He knew that courage recognizes courage, regardless of the color of skin or the culture of birth," Chenoa confirmed. "He knew that when our people faced their greatest threat, salvation would come from someone who understood that doing right matters more than following orders." As winter snow began to fall across the Wyoming territory, Elijah Carson realized that his life of solitude was ending, but his life of purpose was just beginning. The sacred feather would remain in his keeping, a reminder that sometimes the most important prophecies are the ones we fulfill simply by choosing to be decent human beings when decency matters most. The 100 rescued girls would grow up to become teachers, leaders, and keepers of traditions that might otherwise have been lost forever. And they would all remember the old rancher who proved that honor has no boundaries when it comes to protecting the innocent. If this story moved you and reminded you that courage comes in many forms, from small acts of kindness to standing up for those who cannot protect themselves, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. Share this story with someone who needs to remember that sometimes the most important prophecies are fulfilled by ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What's your most powerful story of unexpected heroism or standing up for what's right? Share it in the comments below. Your experience might inspire our next video. Thank you for watching, and remember, true honor isn't about the recognition you receive, but about the principles you're willing to defend when no one is watching.